this, but it's my belief system that the diagnosis of many conditions, physical and mental, in our society have been overdone, and they're overdone for a number of reasons, because there's a lot of benefits that go along with the overdiagnosis of certain disorders. I didn't say all, nor did I say that all mental situations or conditions are invented. I didn't say that, so don't misquote me. I know it's easy to do when you're not listening carefully. But this creativity and psychosis issue intrigues me very much. Norman Mailer wrote a great book about 30 years ago called, I think, Genius and Lust. Raise your hands if you still remember that book. If anyone even knows who Norman Mailer is, I mean, he's been forgotten a long time ago. But Genius and Lust was a very interesting book. And it was, I think it was his ode to Henry Miller, incidentally. I'll be right back.
Join the Savage Nation. Call now, 855-400-SAVAGE, 855-400-7282. Savage.
My Savage Nation is sponsored by SwissAmerica.com. It's the only company I trust to protect my wealth. Call 800-BUY-COIN. I love this topic, creativity and schizophrenia or mental illness, however you want to put it. I mean, that's not the head of the article, but it was creativity and psychosis share a genetic source. Okay, fine, but that could trigger a whole discussion. And it'll lead us all down to the dopamine connection between schizophrenia and creativity. We'll talk about dopamine because according to the National Institute of Mental Health, about 2.5 million American adults have some form of schizophrenia. And that's a disorder which affects perception of reality. That's real. Paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, different symptoms, different stages of the illness. And many people fear schizophrenia, and it's real. Schizophrenia symptoms generally appear between the ages of 16 and 30. And they can include auditory hallucinations in which people hear voices in their heads, and unrealistic beliefs, such as the possession of superpowers, right? How many of you have that? Many of you think you have superpowers, or you know people who do. And I knew kids when I was young who were very sadly schizophrenic. Clearly they were that way. I don't know why. One kid thought he was Superman. I remember to this day, he put on a cape, a Superman costume, and jumped off the, didn't kill himself. He jumped from the top of the staircase in his little attached house and thought he could fly. Well, he got hurt. He didn't die. I'm giving an example. There are terrible things that happen to people from minds that don't function properly, and you can't laugh at it, obviously. Now, no one knows what causes schizophrenia, but genetics and environmental factors certainly play a role. Now, this article argues that there's a genetic component, which I don't doubt. There's a genetic component to anything. But I have to remind you of a very important piece of work for those of you who suffer from these illnesses or this category of illness, who don't have any hope other than to take medication. I'm not telling you to stop taking it. One of the greatest geniuses of our time, who's dead now, was a doctor named Abraham Hoffer, MD, PhD, Canadian by birth. I knew the man personally. I looked up to him greatly. He was a giant in the field of nutrition. He discovered that niacin reduces atherosclerosis the same way that anti-sclerotic drugs work. In other words, instead of Lipitor, you could use high doses of niacin. He discovered this in the 1949-1950 era, and he told me personally that he could have patented it and made a fortune, but he decided to give it to mankind. Could you imagine? And it was never patented, so you could buy niacin over the counter, and many of you use it instead of drugs. Okay. But Hoffer worked with schizophrenic patients his whole life. In fact, I believe he had a daughter who was schizophrenic, if I'm not mistaken. And he insisted that he could reverse schizophrenia with megadoses of niacin. Megadoses of niacin reverse schizophrenia. The medical establishment called him a nut, dismissed him for many reasons. They never did double-blinded studies anyway. But you could look up Abraham Hoffer, Hoffer, on schizophrenia for yourself. It may be of some value for you to look into this possibility. And then we'll come back and talk about creativity, schizophrenia, and all the news that you come to, whatever.
Join the Savage Nation. Call now, 855-400-SAVAGE. Savage. Warning. The Savage Nation contains adult language, adult content, psychological nudity. Listener discretion is advised. And now, America's most exciting radio talk show, The Savage Nation, home of unprotected talk, borders, language, culture. And here he is, Michael Savage.
It's just another manic Monday. Wish it was Sunday.
Well, sex is on your mind. It's on anyone's mind, apparently, whether you're in Pakistan or America. Katzenberg, Matzenberg, and Ratzenberg knows that sex sells, and they keep it in front of your face day and night so you don't focus on the real problems facing the nation, the meltdown of our borders, language, and culture. But let's put them aside for a minute. We're talking about schizophrenia, genius, that kind of thing. Is there a relationship between creativity and psychosis? Well, a new study says there's a common genetic source. And so what does that tell us? We know that to be creative, you have to think differently from everyone else. And we know that carriers of genetic factors that predispose to schizophrenia also can predispose to creativity. And I think the challenge for any artist or any creative person is to not go off the rails, in other words, while creating. But there are other effects, other outside elements that affect whether we go off the rails or can create, okay? And we can look at sex itself. How old should a person be as having their first sex? See, that's a big question. What is the age of consent right now? What should it be? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the most evil, demented people in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court, a woman who has cursed America for all these years on the Supreme Court, a woman who was never qualified to be on the Supreme Court, a woman who had previously been the chief counsel for the ACLU, one of the most dangerous organizations the world has ever seen. It has done more damage to America than ISIS. The ACLU has done more damage to America than ISIS. She was the chief counsel, and she's been on the Supreme Court for many years now, put there by Republicans, incidentally. The same Republicans who rubber-stamped Ruth Bader Ginsburg rubber-stamped Loretta Lynch as Attorney General. The very same character players, incidentally. So why is she being talked about by me? Because she wants the age of consent, the last I checked, lowered to 14 years of age. Well, that's pretty amazing. Everyone knows that younger than a certain age is very harmful to the child. Very harmful. And we live in a society where if a young person has not had sex with another person by a certain age, they consider themselves, well, something's wrong. So there are movies like A 40-Year-Old Virgin, things like that. And you laugh at people who don't have sex. And so a study was done on this very issue of timing of first sex has far-reaching relationship effects. Research looking at how the timing of sexual initiation in adolescence impacts adult romantic ties finds that having sex later may lead to better relationships. Later, not earlier, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg would imply. It says the timing of sexual initiation in adolescence influences romantic outcomes, such as whether people get married or live with their partners, how many romantic partners they've had, and whether they're satisfied with their relationship later in adulthood. It's an interesting study. So they classify those having an early sexual relationship as younger than 15, an on-time one as 15 to 19, or a late one older than 19 as first experience with sexual intercourse. And they published it in Psychological Science. And as expected, later timing of first sexual experience was associated with higher educational attainment and higher household income in adulthood when compared with the early and on-time groups. Individuals who had a later first sexual experience were also less likely to be married, and they had fewer romantic partners in adulthood. I don't know what this means, actually. I think half these studies make no sense. But I think it's an interesting point of departure for a discussion, which is what age of consent should there be in the United States of America? The fanatics at the ACLU want it lowered to 14 or 12 or whatever. Maybe 10 will be the new norm. Maybe in a few more years after Bruce Jenner, it'll be 5. We don't know how sick the society can get. It's melting down faster than Chernobyl did. Let's talk about these topics, would you please? The phone number is 855-407-282. We might have a day of no Obama. We might have an Obama-free day. We have the devil's sound from Europe, like he attacked the judge who blocked his amnesty. We could play that later. I can't even listen to him. I get ill. I have to reach for my niacin when I hear him talk now, and my magnesium aspartate in order to keep from melting down. I hear the devil's voice. I have to reach for both substances. And I have to light a match, make sure some sulfur goes into my nostrils every time he speaks. Let me take some of the calls. There's some great callers out there. KSFO Online, line 7. Go ahead, you're on the Savage Nation.
Yeah, hello, Dr. Savage. I agree with you on the correlation between creativity and mental illness in general. That would include delusions as well as just shifts away from reality. But I also think there's a correlation between very high IQ, a positive correlation, and mental illness also.
Absolutely, there is. And people with super high IQs have to be very careful where they tread mentally. That's what I was getting at.
Right. Because I have a theory for that, a hypothesis. When you have a very high IQ, your imagination is expanded. And if you're not careful, your imagination can overwhelm you, and you mix reality with what could be or what could be imagined, and the line blurs between what actually is and what you think it can be or what you can create.
Absolutely. So let's make this very political. I have posited that Obama is mentally ill. I have said he is deranged in his assessment of what the reality is of the world in which he lives and the expectations he has as to how far he can push the world. Would you agree with me? What motivates this man to think he can override the people, the courts, and reality itself? What's his motivation?
I think he's sociopathic. He's a clinical study in sociopathology, and that would also he's also mental. That is a mental illness, but I think he has severe delusions of who he actually is and what his powers are.
Right. Now, where did he get that? Where did President Obama derive this delusional reality that he lives in? I'll tell you where, from my point of view. Here is a kid, let's not forget he was biracial in Hawaii. And let's not forget that the skids were greased for him from early on. Everything was done for him. He never worked a day in his life. He went to a very expensive high school in Hawaii, Punahou, at full scholarship, paid for by some very wealthy liberals who were cultivating him from early on to become what he has become. This child was handpicked. It's almost like a movie that I saw many years ago about a child who's handpicked to become a leader. And in so doing, he thinks that he actually is as smart as they told him he is. And then he becomes deluded with the thought that he's as powerful as he thinks he is, and he doesn't have any limits. He's never had limits. No one's ever stopped him before.
You're exactly right. His mother gave him up to this group of people, to Frank Davis, who was an agent from Chicago. And then once this was being orchestrated and paid for by very wealthy Marxists, but wealthy Marxists in Chicago. They got him to Chicago afterwards, and then he's basically incubated there and totally surrounded with compliments, with special schooling, the Midwest Academy, and he's promoted with these huge invisible shadow government behind him, all the while nursing in his sick mind that I'm a genius, that I'm an Alexander the Great, that I'm all-powerful, omniscient. And you end up with a flawed individual. He was sick, even when genetically, I think he's a defect. But then add that on, and then you get this monster we have today.
He is a monster, and he's a monster. They're throwing gays off roofs in Iraq, and he does nothing against ISIS. Women, young girls are being kidnapped and raped and sold into slavery. He does nothing. And he gives a crazy speech from Europe. Did you hear it where he said, you have to hear the soundbite. He said, our policy is not yet firm in the Middle East. Robert, do we have that mad statement by the president? It's utterly madness to listen to this. And here we go. Clip 10. You got to hear this one. Listen to this.
When a finalized plan is presented to me by the Pentagon, then I will share it with the American people. It's not, we don't yet have a complete strategy because it requires commitments on the part of the Iraqis as well about how
the
recruitment takes
buck.
place, how that training
Can
takes
you
place.
imagine